6, 1945, a woman in Hiroshima was walking down the street when the bomb fell. And this image captures a personal view of what happened. It's one of 19,000 artifacts that have been donated by families personally to the Hiroshima Peace Museum. When the bomb fell, we don't even know how many people died. The estimates range from 90,000 to 166,000. And for Nagasaki, between 40,000 and 80,000. So I'd like to give an overview of my talk. I'm going to start with some background about the Neutron Trail, and it's going to be focused on some of the seeds that led me to the Japan trip in November 2014. I'm going to talk about a new kind of therapy that I've started to work with that I find augments Neutron Trail in a very powerful way. It's called Systems Constellation Therapy, and some of you from my constellation community are here tonight, so welcome. I'm going to explain more about what it is, but I just want to give a little taste right now that it's the opposite of the way we normally think of therapy, where if I'm the client, I'm doing my work, and the therapist is helping me. With Constellation Therapy, if I'm the client, I offer my issue to the group, and the group works it out. It's kind of a shamanic, kind of a ritual, and I'm using the metaphor of intentional dream to describe it. From there, we're going to Tokyo. So the way that I put the slides together is more in historical order. It's not the order that Noriko and I actually went on the trip. And then to Noriko's house, where we actually started, with my friend Steven, he's a good friend of mine. He lives in San Francisco. He wanted to be here tonight, but a little bit of a far commute. He and Noriko and I, we all took photos, so the show is all of our photos. And then I'll share some experiences in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then to wrap up, I'm going to show you just a few slides of some of the temples, the Shinto shrines and the Buddhist temples that are such a powerful, underlying, sustaining part of the culture in Japan, and such a key as to how Japan is moving on and healing, and how I think its culture can be an exemplar for the world. In the forefront of this photo, you see my grandfather, Enrico Fermi, holding in his hands a photograph of the Hiroshima bomb cloud. And standing right behind him is the physicist Edward Teller. They were both key Manhattan Project physicists, engineering and designing the atomic bomb. To me, this photo is a kind of setup by the photographer. It's artificial in that it gives us the idea that, or it suggests that we can hold this event in our hands and understand it in one image, which I don't think is true. And yet it's an important perspective. The first image I showed you is that it was a completely different perspective. And I'm going to be showing you in the next few minutes even more different perspectives. And that's an important part of my Neutron Trail project, is to look at things from different points of view and to really immerse myself in different points of view. So my project is not political. It's not about finding out who was right or who was wrong in the war. It's about understanding what happened so that we can move forward. In World War II, 50 to 70 million people were killed. And again, we don't know how many people died. It was a horrific war with perpetrators and victims on all sides. This is an image on the ground in Hiroshima shortly after the bomb fell. In the background is the Genbaku Dome, which the people of Hiroshima have left as it is. As you see it there, they've left it as it is, as a monument. And it's in the Peace Park in Hiroshima. And here's an image from Nagasaki. And I don't know about you, but for me, viewing these images, I feel grief and sadness. In 2009, I went to Trinity, which is where the bomb was tested in July 1945. So just a few weeks before it was used. And my grandfather was at the test, and Edward Teller and the other key physicists were there. I headed to Trinity at the invitation of a conceptual artist. Trinity is located in the southwestern United States in a vast open desert. It's only open twice a year. So you see the line of cars, and I found it disturbing to see these SUVs. At the time Bush was president, and there was pro-Bush bumper stickers on some of the cars, and it just made me think more about war, about the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Another thing that troubled me when I was at Trinity was the atmosphere of most everyone around me seemed to be like a tourist site, like checking off another historical site on the list and casually taking our photos with a monument. And meanwhile, I was a churn of emotions inside. I was feeling a dissonance between my own perception and sense of what was happening and what was going on around me. And it really struck me that this should be a sacred place or a place of mourning for the Japanese people who lost their lives, for the citizens of New Mexico who were affected by the test, and for all of humanity for the loss of innocence. And as I stood there in the desert with this, it was just this beautiful sunny day, it was so windy. As I stood there and reflected, I just wondered, what if everyone stopped what they were doing, taking the tourist photos, and thought about peace, and took a moment to send a prayer for peace for those who had died? How might that change what we were doing? And then the wind seemed to enter my body, kind of, I'm saying that metaphorically, and it just seemed to cleanse me. So all that churn of emotions it just washed down through my body into the ground, and I felt cleansed and energized and safe. A few months later, the idea of Neutron Trail came to me. The name Neutron Trail came to me. Actually, I think that visit to Trinity was my first Neutron Trail stop. I made this image, which is two images put together from that New Mexico trip. And it symbolizes that on the Neutron Trail, we're looking back to understand what happened so that we can move forward and make healthier choices in the present and in the future. Before the Japan trip, I did a lot of preparation. In one sense, I've been preparing all my life because I've always been interested in Japanese culture for as long as I can remember, literally way before I thought about Neutron Trail or my grandfather or what happened in Hiroshima. I was thinking about studying Aikido, which is a martial art dedicated to world peace. I studied that for 10 years when I was young. I have some sports injuries left over to remember. I also studied shiatsu for a much shorter time with a master in New York City. And my first job in Canada was giving shiatsu massage. Shortly before the trip, I spent about 300 hours listening to Japanese tapes to try to learn a few phrases. And I did manage to learn to be polite in certain situations and to ask where the bathroom is. That's about it. Noriko did most of the talking. And the main part of the preparation that I want to tell you about is with the Constellation Therapy. So first I need to tell you what it is, because most of you have probably never heard of it. Systems Constellation Therapy started in Germany, was by a man named Bert Hellinger. And he used it to help descendants and those who had survived World War II, either as perpetrators or as victims, come to terms of what had happened and heal the family trauma that they were carrying. The way it works is the person who's the client, in this case me, states their issue. And if it was a family issue, the facilitator might say to me, choose someone in the group to be your mother, choose someone to be your father, choose someone to be yourself, choose someone to be your little brother. And then I would choose those people, and I would put them into a grouping in relation to each other, called a constellation. And then I would just stay back. And each person, it's kind of like channeling, it's kind of shamanic. I know that might sound weird. You don't have to agree with it. I'll just keep describing what happened. And the facilitator's role is simply to help guide, to ask what each person is noticing. And through this process, quite often, conflicts or unresolved cutoff issues, they start to move. And at the end of the constellation, there's a different relationship between the people in the group. Quite often there's a healing energy. Or sometimes so much is opened up that the constellation just stops there and then it continues after. So the constellation that I wanted to set had to do with Neutron Trail. So it was the fourth one that I had done, and I've been finding that this work is a perfect match for Neutron Trail because my project is meant to be cultural. It's not meant to be just about me. It's about, I go and I meet people and they tell me their stories. And so through using the constellation therapy, it's opened things up to other people. And it's also helping me deepen into the emotion of it in a more integrated way. I feel more confidence about my project since I've started doing the constellations. The woman that facilitated the particular constellation, her name is Diana Claire Douglas, and she lives in Ottawa, and I was here in Vancouver, so we had to do it by Skype. It was about a month beforehand. And some of us met at my house, some of us, there was basically 4 different locations, 3 in the Lower Mainland and Diana in Ottawa. And she uses this method of the clock. So that way, wherever the representatives are standing, they can tell each other, okay, I'm at 3 o'clock or I'm at 4:30. Because we just used Skype audio. And she did something very different with her constellation that I'd never seen before, but it fit with Neutron Trail, which is, she asked me to choose the direction for the past and the direction for the future before I started putting the representatives in place. Ultimately, the facilitator decides who the representatives will be, not the client. The client may suggest, but the facilitator decides. So she asked me to choose someone for the spirit of Japan, someone for the Japanese people. And because my intention for the constellation was connection, she asked me to choose someone for connection and also the shadow side, disconnection. Additionally, someone to be myself, Neutron Trail, nuclear legacy. So I placed all of those, but Enrico, she didn't want me to place. She asked someone else to put Enrico in position. And we all thought it interesting that he's in the future. As soon as everyone was in position, she began to check in with the different representatives. Japanese people said that they recognized Enrico as an ancestor. I was really moved by that, by the immediate acceptance. And they bowed to each other. The Japanese people began to feel the presence of the ancestors behind them. And constellation therapy relies a lot on ancestral energy for its healing power. Enrico, when asked, said that he felt terrified holding the legacy in his hands of what he had been involved with. At that point, Olivia said, thinking that there was a lot of pressure on Enrico, he's the only one here who's named, right? There's Japanese people, the spirit of Japan. And then disconnection spoke up and began to morph. And that can happen especially when the representative is an aspect, not an actual person. They might become something else. Like it might clarify, like, you know, in a dream, right? Someone can start out as one figure and then they turn into a cat or a cheesecake or something. So disconnection morphed and said, we're the unrecognized dead. And we have names. And it gives me chills to say it now, because it was this force saying, yes, we need to be recognized. We haven't been recognized. And Enrico was then invited to move back into the past. And as he passed Olivia, he said, I'm willing to move back because you're carrying on my work. Now that was a difficult moment for me in the constellation. I'm not a physicist. I don't see myself directly carrying on my grandfather's work. So I had to think about it. And over the months, what came to me is what's true is his spirit is with me, and more so. And towards the end of his life, he became interested in human evolution. There's a quote that I found where he's saying, technology is going to continue. The question is, will we become mature enough to handle it? So once Enrico moved back into the past, and the ancestors did as well, the sense of terror was gone, and there was some grief for the unrecognized dead. And as that shifted, we began, each of us, to feel a sense of peace and ease. The Japanese people were able to move to a position where they could face the future because of the support of the ancestors that had coalesced. So now everyone in the constellation is looking towards the future. And the spirit of Japan said this is a very important moment. The spirit of Japan didn't move through the constellation, but somehow added this dimension that, I don't know how to put it in words, added a dimension. And Neutron and Japanese people said, we can now face the future. We can tackle the nuclear legacy. And they said they sensed Olivia leading them in some way. So that was very powerful for me. I've shared a number of pieces, and many of them showed up on the trip, either in subtle ways or in obvious ways. So in the next few minutes, you'll hear about that. I decided ahead of time to see if I could find someone who did constellation therapy in Japan. And I Googled, and I was lucky to find an English-Japanese website. So I wrote, and the woman wrote me back. And she said, well, actually, I'm married to a Dutch person, and we live in the Netherlands. But the dates that you're going to be in Tokyo happen to overlap when we're going to Tokyo to give a constellation workshop. So they agreed to meet me. Noriko dropped me off at the train station, and they met me there. And we spent a very happy 9 hours together. We completely clicked with each other. On the left is Bert, in the middle is me, and on the right is his wife, Hisako. They're both constellation facilitators. And Bert is a retired mathematician. As our conversation went on, I began to tell them about the constellation that I just shared with you. And when I got to the part about the unrecognized dead, Bert stopped me. It was a profound moment. And he said that he and Osaka see in their practice people who have entanglements with the firebombing, where their descendants were bombed in the firebombings that happened before Nagasaki and Hiroshima were bombed with atom bombs. And the firebombings is something that we don't, I'm going to say we, at least from my culture, don't usually think about. And when planning my trip to Japan, I wasn't thinking, oh, we're going to go to a memorial for the firebombing. There isn't that kind of profile the way there is for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so he began to tell me things that I dimly knew, but that I hadn't really taken in before. And he explained that on March 10th, 1945, which is 70 years ago today, B-29s flew over Tokyo, and the largest number of people killed in war at any one time happened that night. 100,000 people died, and much of the city was destroyed. So I think we're all feeling this. I know I'm feeling a kind of grief and poignancy looking at these images and thinking about what happened. And we wouldn't have had that conversation if the unrecognized dead hadn't spoken up in the constellation. This is an image in Tokyo, 1945, of trying to count the dead, which was an impossible task. And when I told Bert about the constellation, he said, those people need at least to be counted, because being counted is a kind of recognition. And he's a mathematician, and he's been working on this project, and since we met, he's picked it up again. It was something he started a few years ago. And so we may publish an article together next year. It's very difficult to do. There will never be an exact number. The regular histories say around 400,000. He believes at least 1 million, if not more. Very, very hard to determine. So I'd like to take a moment of silence to remember those souls. Thank you. May they rest in peace. At my hotel in Tokyo, just about, 5 minutes walk, there was a shrine. So if I walked out of my hotel towards the subway, I passed this shrine. And I'm including it here because one of the most profound things for me was how deeply the prayer, I call it prayer culture, it's my own invented term, I hope I'm not offending anyone with it. How deeply the prayer culture is part of Japan. Whether or not any one person is going to the shrine, the culture participates in a way. The gates are open, anyone can go and take a minute to be quiet, set an intention, leave a prayer, and then go on about their day. So for the few days that I was in Tokyo on the way to the subway, I would stop here and do that. And then I'd go on to my sightseeing. Here we are at the Osaka train station with Noriko, Olivia, and Stephen at the beginning of our adventure. This is a photo right outside Noriko's door. Her house is right here. And her family had a kimono shop in the home. Noriko's standing in the front of the house where the kimono shop was. So it's one style of traditional home. She's recently redone it. This part has the traditional tatami mats. And not pictured are a small Shinto shrine and a small Buddha shrine. That was another thing that struck me about Japanese prayer culture, is that it's not like, okay, I'm Jewish and you're Christian and you're Islamic. The Buddhist culture and the Shinto traditions are available to everyone. And they seem to be used in different ways by everyone. This is Susami Harbor, which is about a 5-minute walk from her house. And you notice in the harbor there's a red gate. So the gates mark the openings of the temples and the shrines. They also mark beautiful spots in nature. Did I say Susami means rough water? So there's a big breakwater here. And the Japanese brand in a very different way than the Westerners do. In her area, which is south of Osaka. Wakayama is her province. It's directly south of Osaka, and it's on the ocean. There's a lot of scuba diving. In the harbor at Susami, there's actually a post box under the water, so if you have your scuba equipment, you can go and mail a letter there. We took the train, which is also branded, and we passed many little rice fields, little farms along the way, wherever we were in Japan. This gate is to mark this beautiful natural rock formation. And while Stephen went on a hike, Noriko and I went to the hot bath, or the onsen, and we had a gorgeous view, a big giant window view as long as the gallery is, looking out onto the mountainside in the beginning of the fall colors. And meanwhile, he went for a short hike on the Kumano Kodo, which is a sacred walk in Wakayama. And there's only 2 UNESCO sacred heritage walks, and this is one of them. It's a very accessible walk, but not that many people outside of Japan know about it. For over 1,000 years, people have been taking this walk. And there's many shrines along the way. It's a beautiful chance to be out in nature. The Sugendo monks are associated with this area of Wakayama and this sacred temple walk. And part of their tradition is that by being in nature, it's a way to find enlightenment. Japanese scarecrow. Noriko took us to the Shinto shrine where her parents were married in a city called Tanabe, which is also in Wakayama. And she taught me how to go through the gate. You don't go through the center, because that's where God goes. You walk through on the side. So before you enter, you stand and you bow. And if you want to be extra formal as you go to the other side, you can bow again. There's places at each shrine where you can cleanse with water. And the way it works is you take a little bit of water and, wait, you pour it on your right hand first? No, your left hand. Right? Yeah, okay, you pour it on your right hand first, just a few drops. Left hand, a little bit on your mouth. And then you stand it straight up and you let the water fall over the fountain. Or if you're visiting a grave, you let the water fall over the grave. So that's how you can do a cleansing, and it only takes a minute. So again, it's these beautiful little ways that, like drops of water, after a while they have a huge impact on the fabric of the whole culture, and certainly on my whole experience there. And they eased the suffering that we were going to visit. They sustained me, I think they sustained us. Inside the shrine area was this old tree and some other ones. I think it's about 600 or 800 years old. And it's very family oriented. Sometimes you see cars parked inside, people ride their bikes in. It's true you can't go into some of the buildings unless you're part of that particular temple, but it really has a very open feeling. And there's even kitty cat prayers. So now we're going to Hiroshima. And this is a view from the museum looking out onto the Peace Park. And in the background you can see the Genbaku Dome. This is one of the statues donated to peace in the park. Here's the dome. Noriko and I were both very sensitive to energy. And when we were at Hiroshima, taking these pictures and looking at the dome, we both seemed to feel a kind of angst that was more than just the loss. Partly we were feeling the shock of the loss of the bombings, but we both also felt partly we were feeling some other disturbance, maybe from all the tourists coming through. It's hard to tell. So I've been telling you here and there about preparations before the trip. This one I'm going to tell you now is really quite out of the blue. I happened to be reading an email about this man, Jim Doyle, who's a whistleblower speaking up about nuclear proliferation and how wrong it is. He was fired from Los Alamos National Lab. That's what LANO stands for. And he went on to continue. So he wasn't silenced, he's actually speaking louder now. And it was one of those emails that was in my inbox for a week or so, and it was like, oh yeah, I gotta read that email. And then because lots of them I delete these days, there's so many, but I did read it, and then I decided to write to him and thank him, so I just sent off an email saying, thank you for this work you're doing, it's so important. Well, 20 minutes later, I got an email back from him asking me about my project, Neutron Trail. So then I wrote a longer email explaining, and at the end I said, I'm going to Japan next. Well, a couple hours later, he was telling me about this woman, Yumi Kanazaki. He introduced us. She's a journalist in Hiroshima. The fantastic thing is, the day we were writing each other, Yumi was there in Santa Fe interviewing Jim. She's working on a story for the 70th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima this August. So there's a team of 4 reporters at her paper working on this story. She was traveling around the United States, and on that day, she was there with Jim. She wanted to meet me in Japan, and we Skyped for about an hour ahead of time before I left. And then she introduced me to a good friend of hers who's an atomic bomb survivor, Tanaka-san. And Tanaka-san invited Noriko and I and Yumi to her house for tea, and you can see we got quite a beautiful spread. She was she's 76 now. She was 6 years old when the bomb fell, and she was so traumatized she never talked about it for her entire life. She became a visual artist as a way to deal with the angst that she was holding inside herself. And then 6 years ago, when she was 70, she met some people who encouraged her to speak, and she began to talk about her experience. And so now she's dedicating her life to peace. And she's part of a project called Peace Boat, that's a Japanese nonprofit. And they take people on cruises into international waters, so beyond any national boundaries or conflicts. And there, in those international waters, she and others give talks to the passengers about peace.